Hello everyone, I'm Nick Haynes and welcome to a special hour-long edition of Kansas City Week in Review as we wrestle with one of the most contentious issues on Capitol Hill right now, immigration.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free.
Nothing like this has ever happened. We have millions of people told, essentially, you have a get-out-of-jail-free card.
We're actually spending more in immigration enforcement than in all of our federal law enforcement agencies combined.
As the President and Congress wrestle over changes to our nation's immigration policy, we're on location at the Community of Christ in Independence as we convene both sides of the immigration question for a fact-based conversation about what's at stake. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach has been in the vanguard of the legal effort to strengthen the country's immigration laws. Flying in from Washington, D.C., Clarissa Martinez de Castro joins us. She's Vice President of La Raza, the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization. Plus, as we dissect the implications for Kansas and Missouri, two economists.
Economists disagree, and I defer to the economists.
Disagree? What a surprise.
Also this hour, we take you to the dinner tables of area families as they discuss the immigration question.
If one is having difficulty economically, and if one is having difficulty socially, they're going to blame someone, and they have to seek out and throw that anger towards others.
If you have a supply of well-trained workers, people who can do it, actually people who are hungrier than the people born here, won't that make it a better marketplace?
Absolutely.
My opinion, if they're illegals, they need to go back. And it don't matter if they've been here 25 years. If I do something illegal, I get fined, I go to jail. They're doing something illegal. It's no different from them than it is me.
They like to call us a melting pot. Some of us don't want to melt, you know. Some of us want to be able to stay what we were. If we'd have demanded everybody learn the indigenous language, you'd have had to learn a whole lot of them to come here.
We're partnering this hour with the Village Square, a civil conversation initiative headquartered out of UMKC. And they have fact-checkers standing by and a civility bell.
Very good. Okay. So if you hear that, that's the signal to stop talking.
That's your moderator for this hour, Village Square founder, former ambassador, and UMKC professor, Alan Katz.
This is meant to be not a confrontation, but a conversation. And a conversation where I'm going to invite the panelists up one at a time. If I could have Secretary Chris Kobach come join me. Don't do it. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. What do you think we as a country right now, given the facts on the ground, the circumstances that we have, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, a number of things. I come to this from my perspective as a lawyer and a former professor of law, and I served in the first four-year term of the Bush administration as John Ashcroft's counsel and chief advisor on immigration law. So I come to this looking at it from a lawyerly perspective of there's a big difference between legal and illegal immigration. And legal immigration is very good, has been good for the development economically and culturally of our country. Illegal immigration is by definition immigration that is contrary to the national interests of our country as defined by federal law. And you often hear the phrase, well, America is a country of immigrants, we've always had immigration, and so everything is the same now as it always was then. We have to know that there has been a real change after 1965. Prior to 1965, immigration to the United States was almost exclusively legal. And the country they were coming into was a country largely without a social safety net. You did not have the welfare state today. Then after 1965, with the landmark Immigration Act that Congress passed in that year, you had a number of significant changes, but you started having waves of illegal immigration, especially starting in the 70s and 80s, and we have a welfare state. So now you have lots of illegal immigration accompanying the legal immigration, and we are in the most generous welfare state of the Western Hemisphere, although the Canadians might try to contest with us on that one.
Do you think that there's a direct correlation between the number of people coming here and the existence of those social programs?
I do, and I think there's also a correlation between the likelihood that a person will stay here and the existence of those social programs. So for example, in one of the most generous benefits we give to people who come here illegally is the best K through 12 public education in the Western Hemisphere. And after the Supreme Court case of Plyler versus Doe in 1982, the Supreme Court said every state has to provide that for free, whether they want to or not. And so that's one of the big benefits that people get when they come here. This is an interesting statistic, and for the fact checkers, wherever they may be, there's an April 2011 study done by the Center for Immigration Studies, and I think the numbers here were really amazing. 71% of illegal alien-headed households take advantage of some form of welfare, chiefly food assistance and Medicaid. That compares to 52% of lawfully present alien households versus 39% of households headed by a U.S. citizen. Here's another statistic that I think says a lot about the predicament the United States is in. The United States-Mexico border, and of course the largest single country that sends any nationals, both legal and illegal, to the United States is Mexico, has the highest disparity in per capita income, in GDP income, of any international border on the planet. In other words, the difference between the rich country and the poor country is greater than any other border on the planet. So that affects things too. And may I mention one last thing? Sure. And that is I think regardless of where people stand on the question of should the United States grant an amnesty to the 11 million plus people here illegally, I would hope that most people would agree that we should do this through the constitutional avenues defined in our founding document, and that is that Congress would pass an amnesty, as it is a quintessentially legislative act, and it should not be done through presidential fiat.
Nick, you have a question?
Yeah, Alan, I've been roaming around the room, and we have a question from Paul. Your question, Paul.
Sir, I'd like to know what would characterize a good immigration law.
One change to our immigration laws would be requiring all states, right now only it's either 4 or 5 states, require all businesses to use the E-Verify system, which creates a level playing field so that one employer can't undercut another employer by hiring illegal labor. I think all employers in the country should use that. It's a computer-based system. You do it on the internet. You get a verification from the federal government immediately whether the person you're contemplating hiring is illegal or not. I think that would be a great statutory change that we should have. If you're asking in a more broad concept, I think our immigration laws governing legal immigration should clearly put U.S. national interests first. So let me just end on this one point. We are in the perfect seat, if you will, from an immigration perspective. There are more people who want to come to America than want to come to any other country in the world. So we have the ability to glean the cream of the crop if we want. We can satisfy whatever national interests we have. If our national interest is bringing science and technology graduates to America, we can do that. If our national interest is bringing relatives of present people living in the United States, we can do that. So we should make our national immigration policy and laws conform to our national interests, and illegal immigration undercuts that because we have no say in who comes to this country illegally.
Okay, thank you. Let me expand the conversation here and invite Clarissa to join us up here. Clarissa Martinez de Castro works in the Office of Research, Advocacy, and Legislation at NCLR, one of the nation's largest Hispanic advocacy and civil rights organizations. Welcome. Okay, well, you've heard what Chris had to say, and we decided, by the way, we're all going to be on a first-name basis because this makes life a lot easier.
That's good.
So,
and my last name is really long.
Your last name is too long, exactly right. So Clarissa, you heard what Chris had to say. I suspect that you probably don't come to the same conclusion that he does. So why don't you explain your perspective on this, okay?
Well, I mean, the good thing is that there are at least 3 agreements. As Chris said, generally we all agree that legal immigration is a good thing for our country. And it's not just because it's part of our history and something that we can romanticize and feel good about, but actually from an economic perspective, it's also been good for the country. I would also say the other agreement is that our immigration system is broken. How to fix it is where we got to do a little bit of work. And the last thing is that, and I don't think it gets quite articulated, but by everybody, but I think most folks would agree that illegal immigration is not a good thing, and that we need to figure out how to address that and how to prevent it. So if we have generally those three agreements, and I'll make that assumption, then why is it that this issue continues to be so hard? Most of the polling over the last 10 years, the majority of Americans agree that we need a combination of policies that are going to make sure our borders are secure, that are going to make sure that people come here legally and not around the system or with smugglers, and that we need to do something to address the fact that we have about 11.5 million people who are currently living in the country illegally. And that the majority of the public also agrees we are not going to deport our way out of doing away with that population. I would say that a lot of the people who have also blocked proposals in Congress agree with that last part. If you ask very directly whether they think that the policy of self-deportation is going to work, or that we're going to be able to put in boxcars and ship out that many people, that it's just not realistic. For some folks, it's not necessarily something that they would like to see our country do. And I do realize what Chris said about the economic disparities between Mexico and the United States. The interesting thing is that the immigration we're seeing is not just from people coming south of the border, right? As a matter of fact, immigration with Mexico in the last few years has been at net zero. Because of economic growth, because of demographic pattern changes in Mexico. Now, there's other migrants coming from further south. The interesting thing about the folks that are currently living in our country without papers is that the vast majority of them have been here for over 10 years. Imagine in 10 years, what do? You fall in love, you get married, you have families. And so we have a much more complex situation today because the problem has festered for a long time. And we have dealt with this problem in the past. As a matter of fact, I am a beneficiary of the last big overhaul on immigration that was done under President Reagan. But the one thing that we didn't quite fix correctly was our legal immigration system. So if you think about it, the last time that we looked at those mechanisms were times when a cell phone was probably around the size of this table. Our global economy and the needs of our own domestic economy were different.
Thank you very much. Did you have another question for us?
We have lots of questions coming in, Alan. Let me just give you a couple. We'll start with one. This is from George. After this new reform is passed, some people will sneak into the country illegally. What happens to them? Won't the same arguments, the need to bring people out of the shadows, produce yet another amnesty for them down the road? Don't future potential border crossers realize this?
Well, statistically, that's correct. People come in either to fraudulently claim they're eligible for that amnesty or to wait for the next one. And so nowadays, even when Congress starts talking about an amnesty and deliberating, you see a spike in illegal immigration, people coming in. So yes, I agree with the questioner's premise that when you have an amnesty, you will bring in more illegal immigration.
Coming up, two regional economists join the conversation, but first, we take you to dinner at the Cardillo family in Kansas City, Kansas, which, despite being here for years, is feeling the sting of the anti-immigrant backlash.
The racial animus, from my experiences back in the 70s and 80s, it was there, but the hatred towards those of Latino descent is far worse now than then. We have to find out why.
Your Fellow Americans is a project asking questions about race, immigration, and the American dream. We're just trying to figure out what it means to be American for as many different folks as possible. In December of 2014, Your Fellow Americans joined 3 generations of a Mexican-American family around the dinner table to discuss race, immigration, and the American dream.
I think racism in America today, in a lot of ways, we've come a long ways. So when I think about my parents and grandparents and, you know, the separation and all of those things that they encountered. In a lot of ways, we've come a long ways. In a lot of ways, we're going backwards.
So do you think it's harder to be Latino when you were young versus being Latino at their age?
Even if you go to the movies, you can sit in the middle or in the right side. You have to sit in the left side. All the Mexicans and blacks. Right now, you can sit wherever you want it.
I don't think that I've experienced discrimination, but I feel like I've been stereotyped with people at school saying that just by the look of me, I can speak Spanish, which I don't speak Spanish.
In middle school years, this one incident happened where I was called a beaner, and just because I wouldn't give this one dude a pencil, I guess. And I didn't know actually what it meant, so I asked my mom. She said it was just another word for a Mexican, another hurtful word for a Mexican that shouldn't be used, but it's pretty used right now.
Now, times have changed. Certainly when I was a child, it wasn't as bad in my eyes as it is now to be a Latino. We often see now, in this day and age, there's a lot of hatred out there. A lot of hatred just because of the way you look.
There's many people that probably still look at me without knowing me and assume we're here as a race, meaning the Latino community, just to get and not give, and that's not necessarily true.
Just because of the way you talk. A lot of fear. In my opinion, a lot of it is socioeconomic. If one is having difficulty economically, and if one is having difficulty socially, they're going to blame someone, and they have to seek out and throw that anger towards others. Who do they go after? The weakest. It would be immigrants. And it's not just the recent immigrants. You can go back to history. It's always been that way. Any immigrant group that came in a large wave always experienced what we're experiencing now.
You know, I mean, I can't deny that it affects you. And I can't deny that somebody not having the same experience couldn't understand it. You know, but we really do have to figure out what we do with it. And that's kind of the thing with my kids, is that they're always going to understand not everyone's going to like them. And when we talk about this all the time, because they are Hispanic, or because they do have a certain last name, or because, you know, they have dark hair versus, you know, something else. But we tell them, you know, you have to move through that.
According to the Cadillo household, racism in the United States has gotten worse for Latinos. Ryan Cadillo wants to know why. Are Latinos simply bearing the brunt of our nation's troubles like other immigrant groups in our history? Or is it something else? Let's talk about it. Comment below or visit kcpt.org/yourfellowamericans.
You've heard some discussion here about the best interest of the United States. You heard what Chris said about the economic impact as it relates to illegal alien families drawing more from the social network than others. What does your research show?
I mean, you have to understand that the welfare state varies dramatically across the states. There are very generous states like California, and I would say Missouri and Kansas are not the most generous states when it comes to providing a social safety net.
The study that we did was for the states of Kansas and Missouri, and the purpose of the study was to estimate the fiscal impact of immigration in general. As a part of that study, we also looked at unauthorized immigration and came up with some numbers which basically say that immigrants more than pay for their state and local services in terms of the taxes that they generate. A big part of the question is, how do you classify the children of illegal immigrants who are born in the United States? Mr. Kobach said earlier that by definition an illegal alien is illegal. By definition, a child of an illegal immigrant born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. And so to count the education of that child as a part of the cost of illegal immigration is questionable at best.
Yeah, that's a big factor. You can get different numbers depending on how you count the children.
But here's an interesting thing that I always feel gets lost in the picture, which is that very few of us understand just how difficult it is for many immigrants to actually come here legally, which is one of the reasons I was saying that we have to look at our legal immigration system as a proactive way to address illegal immigration. But on that, right, so there's this notion that the trade-off for being undocumented is that you get a lot of benefits, but you don't have any of the responsibilities. Interestingly enough, and perhaps you'll know the numbers better than I will, there is a surplus in the Social Security out of funds that have been contributed by immigrants who are undocumented and therefore are not going to be able to claim those benefits. Billions of dollars who are going to be able to make the Social Security system more solvent for you and me, particularly as the United States is heading and facing a graying America. Yes, we live next to an economy that is less thriving than ours. I haven't figured out yet how to move the United States to a different geographical location. So if I'm going to stay here, and if I have 11.5 million people who are here, not all of them are good, then I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I fix this?
Okay, Nick, you have a question?
Yeah, lots of questions coming in. We have from a table here, Eric, what about the wages of unskilled workers? Doesn't the law of supply and demand say that this will drive wages for basic work down at least a bit?
It is a question that's been tossed around by economists, and there are varying opinions. I have seen all the way from a 10% at the low end impact up to 30%. Chris?
Yeah, in fact, that's an even bigger number than I was going to mention. One economist who's probably one of the best known in this area is George Borjas at Harvard, and he's studied the wage impact of immigration, and he's looking at both legal and illegal in this number, but he concluded that for every 10% increase in a particular labor market due to immigration, there will be a 7 to 8% drop in wages in the short term and a 3 to 4% drop in wages in the long term. And then if you just take an example of an industry which people in Kansas are certainly familiar with, especially those living farther west, is meatpacking. 30 years ago, meatpacking had a much larger percentage of U.S. citizens engaged in that particular job. It was a good paying job. A lot of people, college students did it during the summer. A lot of people did it as a starter job. And the starting wage was $11 to $12 an hour, depending on which state you're talking about. Now, 30 years later, the starting wage is going to be about $7 an hour in the South, about $9 or so an hour in Kansas. So the wages have actually gone down in 30 years, just using absolute dollars. And if you adjust those dollars for inflation, it's way down. And that is because of the influx of mainly illegal immigration into that particular market.
There's a wrinkle there. Meatpacking in the 1970s up until the early 1980s was highly unionized. And a union wage was a living wage. And what happened was there was a big strike, Hormel plant in the 1980s. The union was busted. And if you have immigrants, they tend not to unionize. And so it could be supply and demand, but it could also be the fact that that industry, along with most of our industries in this country, most of our heavy industry, dangerous jobs, have de-unionized. And with that, their wages have fallen.
The thing that's interesting on this is obviously, I find it fascinating that people who run meatpacking industries, I guess, don't have any say in wages. It's all immigrants who are driving them down. But, the one thing I would say is this. I personally like it when I have a scapegoat or something or someone I can easily blame all things on. It makes things easier. In my house, that's normally my husband, but he's not here. So, but I think, and I agree. If I was sitting just listening to this issue, it'd be incredibly frustrating and confusing, because you've heard Chris cite some studies by institutions that sounds like, very smart institutions. On the other hand, those same institutions have been, the way they do their analysis, for some of the reasons you've mentioned here about how hard it is to come up with some of those numbers, have been highly discredited by other institutions, right? So sitting back looking at this, one can think like, okay, how do I figure this out? So perhaps in order to put things into perspective is this. So every previous wave of immigrants in the history of our country, whether they were German, whether they were Italian, whether they were Irish, Japanese, Chinese, now Latino, has experienced the exact same thing. I don't care if the laws were different and before 1965, they went through the same thing. The first generation struggled to learn English, to get integrated, to do better. The second generation was more on the English side. Third generation was like basically English monolingual. Same thing is happening with immigrants today. Those immigrants also were blamed for every ill that was happening at the time, deemed not worthy of becoming American, and accused of bringing disease. I know it sounds familiar. And just to state the obvious, I would say that with every wave of those immigrants before, we were also warned with such intensity that they will bring about the demise of our country. Every one of them. And here we are today. If you look at the news, you could walk away thinking, oh my God, we are being overtaken. Run for your lives and lock the door. It makes it sound like every corner you turn, there's a mass of immigrants coming in. The immigrant population in the United States right now, the whole of it, people who are naturalized US citizens like me, people who are legal permanent residents, and people who are undocumented, is about 13% of the whole US population. The size of the population who is undocumented is 0.036% of the US population. I just find that fascinating when I listen to the intensity of the debate and the danger compared to the numbers.
Nick, you have a question. Let's go. Yes, a question here from Matt. How would you go about, Mr. Kobach, deporting 11 million illegal immigrants? If deportation is not the solution, what is?
Okay, I'd be happy to answer that. But if my math is correct, 11 million over, what is the current population of the United States, 320? 11 over 320 million is about 3%. So maybe you got a couple zeros off, but it's roughly 3% of the population. Right. As for what to do with the 11.5 million here, I believe empirically that attrition through enforcement works. And attrition through enforcement is simply the idea that when you have significant law breaking, in any form of law breaking, the best way to address it is to ratchet up the penalties for breaking the law, because people are rational utility maximizers. Their economists have to agree, because they always, people are irrational? Okay. Well, most people will react to costs and benefits, to the stimuli, economics, and others.
Depends on the probability of being caught.
Right, exactly. And of course, if you ratchet up the level of enforcement, the probability of getting caught increases. And so
how much of our freedom are we willing to sacrifice to catch 11 million people who are here undocumented?
I imagine, the way I'm proposing would be zero, because, well, let me get to this. Yeah. So let's say we have, let's imagine an example of a highway. Say I-70 between Topeka and Kansas City never has any police on it. There's never been anyone issued a ticket. What would happen? It would be the Kansas Autobahn eventually, right? People driving 100 miles an hour with impunity, because everybody knows you will not get caught. You don't address that problem by saying, well, we're going to have 100% enforcement, i.e. deport everyone. You don't arrest every speeder. You put a few law enforcement officers out there, and you catch 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 50, and everybody's behavior changes. Similarly with illegal immigration, if you start more aggressively deporting some, not all, and if you make it very difficult to get the benefit of a job through E-Verify nationwide, then you will have the benefits of being here illegally going down, the costs of being here illegally going up, and people will self-deport or leave on their own, go home on their own. And we know this because that's what Arizona did.
More audience questions coming up, but first, we check in with another area family around the dinner table. Ever wonder what area Native Americans are thinking about the immigration question? We took our cameras out to capture those views.
In September of 2014, we joined a Lakota Indian family around the dinner table at their home near Kansas City to hear their views on race, immigration, and the American dream.
I think it goes a lot to that same immigration topic, is because that's why people come here, for exactly that reason, what the American dream means to them. And, you know, you want to be able to provide for your children and make sure that they grow up loved and happy. But I don't think people necessarily want to have to give up who they are to achieve it. And unfortunately, sometimes that happens.
Well, it happens bit by bit. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens one step in one direction leads to a second step in that direction.
It comes down to that.
And at a certain point in time, you can't remember where you came from, or what your original goal was, or where you were originally headed.
They like to call us a melting pot. Some of us don't want to melt. You know, some of us want to be able to stay what we were, but still be able to respect that diversity and respect other people's ways of being. You know, and not expect them to have to change. I mean, if we'd have demanded everybody learn the indigenous language, you'd have had to learn a whole lot of them to come here.
Mexicans, they were here before. They were here with our people before Europeans. Everybody forgets that. They just throw up this imaginary line in the ground and then say, hey, you're not supposed to be here.
With respect to immigration, with people that are coming from south of the border, it's been said that the border crossed them, they didn't cross the border. The people, Mexican people, Mexica people, they were here on this continent far before anyone. They were here too. Just like the Lakota people were, like any of the other indigenous people were, they're indigenous. And so it's laughable to me that people get upset about them wanting to come to the United States, especially if it's because they're seeking what they think might be a better way for their family, because that's how most of the people in the United States got here. And Indian people welcomed them in.
I mean, look at the first immigrants that came here. They would have probably not made it through the first couple winters if it wouldn't have been for their hosts, the Indians. I mean, really, you know?
What makes me sad is when I see there are just lines and lines of people standing out there screaming at kids. And it's just disgusting to me.
They're hungry. They want food. They need love, they need somebody to take care of them.
When you think about it, we're all immigrants. We weren't the first people to be here. There was other things created before humans. So the earth is not our, well, we cannot call the earth ours. So I think immigration is okay. I think people from Mexico and Canada can come to America if they want to.
And I think they've heard that story. You know, this is America, and they can do this, and they can do that, and you can do this, and you can do that. Oh yeah, the fairy tale. And so they're thinking, wow, you know, I want to be part of that. And so they come this way in hopes that maybe they can get part of that. And quite often they don't get anything except worse than what they had, or not any better.
Do you think immigrants are finding a better place here? Are they finding a better life in the United States than in their former countries? Comment below or visit kcpt.org/yourfellowamericans.
President Obama was referred to in a way that he did not particularly find enjoyable as the deporter-in-chief, because there were more formal deportations. And as everyone may or may not know, the formal deportation makes it much more difficult for individuals once they've gone through the formal process of being deported than during the prior administrations, where basically they would put them on a bus and they would send them back to Mexico. So you have here the number that I see, as a share of the total deportations, according to the statistics that I have, which is the Migration Policy Institute, that it went up rather drastically between 2007 and 2012. So what I would, and at the same time, and then we know that the number of Border Patrol people went up dramatically, and the number of people apprehended went down. So what I would say to you is, haven't we had a pretty robust enforcement increase?
No. Interior enforcement has pretty much ground to a halt. The last time we had any workplace raided, where the doors are closed and ICE comes in and sees who's legally, was in 2009. One of the first things the Obama administration did was end worksite enforcement. There is no worksite enforcement in America right now. The only thing they do now are the only thing they do now are what they call checks. Are checks of they do checks of the documents that the employers keep to see if the paperwork matches up. They do audits, but they do not close the place down. Now the other thing that we have to remember about those numbers is, starting in 2011, the Obama administration began cooking the books, and they started counting what's called ATEP. Okay, I won't use the term cooking the books, manipulating the numbers. They started counting ATEP, which is alien transfers at, I believe the E stands for entry point, so that if you were caught coming across the border, previously you were turned around right where you were by the Border Patrol, and that was not counted as a deportation. What they started doing is then saying, well, now we're going to start deporting people 50 miles down the border or 200 miles down the border to make it harder for them to re-enter. And they started counting those as deportations, just like any normal interior deportation. And that inflated the numbers by about 80,000 a year. And so actually, if you take out the ATEPs, then the number goes down to about 325,000 a year. So the numbers are at an all-time record low.
Nick, you got
Alan, another question. If immigrants are coming to the United States for economic opportunity, is there something we as a country should be doing to, in regard to foreign relations, to help these countries improve their own economic situations?
Clarissa, you want to take that?
Sure. Before I do, by the way, I just wanted to thank you for the fact check. I used to be really good at math. Look, we are in a global economy. So what is happening in other places in the world affects all of us. And proximity sometimes makes it easier for some people to migrate, but the truth is that the U.S. is attracting people from everywhere. I think particularly last summer, when we saw a surge of children coming from Central America as a result of very dire, in a failed state, in particular in Honduras and Central America, that made those children migrate north and seek refuge in the United States. I think it brought really a greater prominence to the fact that what's happening economically in other countries, if there's lack of opportunity there, people are going to seek opportunity elsewhere, right? And for people in this hemisphere, all of the countries in the region, including the United States, saw a spike in people. As a result of that, it was more having to do with fleeing the violence in the area. But economic opportunity is a big part of it.
You may remember this past summer, we had estimates of somewhere 60 to 70 million minors arriving in the United States, principally from
70 million. 1,000.
Did I say million?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 1,000. All these zeros are moving. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. 1,000.
One for each of you.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that's
we're
good.
even. That is not that 60 to 70,000 is a direct result of the president's 2012 executive amnesty, because that amnesty said if you enter the United States before the age of 16, and it had other criteria too, but the main one is if you enter before the age of 16, you can get this amnesty. It is not, they were not coming principally for jobs, because most people who are 15, 14, 13 are not coming to enter the workforce in the United States. And they were not entering principally as a result of political violence. In past examples of refugees responding to political violence, the parents do not usually send the children. Usually the whole family comes to the United States and claims asylum in the United States. This was unprecedented, children only. And so, if you still aren't convinced, then take Jay Johnson's word for it, Secretary of Homeland Security. He went back down to, I believe it was Honduras, it might have been Venezuela, I think it was Honduras, he gave a speech. And in his speech, he said in so many words, he said, parents who are sending your children to the United States, don't do it because they won't qualify for the amnesty. They had to be here before June 15th, 2012. So stop sending them. So he and the Department of Homeland Security believed that the influx was a result of people sending their kids north in the belief that the kids would get to stay, and then in the hope that they would eventually be able to bring the whole family. So that was the motivator for that influx. It was not political violence, and they came from more than just one country too, by the way.
More of your questions on immigration reform answered in just a moment, but first we head to the Northland, where the Shafee family is sizing up the immigration question as they gather for dinner.
Kian Shafee immigrated from Iran in the 1950s. Every Sunday, Kian and his wife Judy have their children and grandchildren over for dinner. In February of 2014, we joined them around the table to hear their thoughts on race, immigration, and the American dream.
Okay, guys, what we're going to do, we're going to discuss immigration. Okay. Because that's the subject these people were interested in, and they discussed it with me in detail. I'll tell you what I said. I said I agreed with one of those Republicans that was in the primary. I can't remember his name, even though they
Ryan?
told me.
It's not on the count.
Romney.
They're on underneath.
Romney said, guys, listen.
He's more centralist.
Romney said that we need to go ahead, any college graduate, university graduate from foreign countries in this country, when he graduates, we hand him a diploma, hand him a green card.
Well, I don't go that far. I say anybody that graduated from the university here with a good average, allow him to work in this country for any company that hires him, at least 6 months. If after 6 months he still has a job, hand him a green card. That person will become somebody someday.
Because apparently the guy will have some gumption to stay and work.
How do you get a job without a green card?
At the time I started looking for a job, I did go for an interview. They didn't care. They will hire you.
Large corporations have the potential and the tie-in to be able to file the proper paperwork. We looked into this for our cousin Patrick.
I understand that there are certain visas allowed to students to come into America. What I find unfortunate is that after we have widened their horizons and educated them and offered them opportunities to expand their knowledge base, we do not offer them the American dream, which is great for their own countries because their own countries are enriched with the education they were afforded in America. But in America, we should try and keep that knowledge in our own country so that we can compete in a global economy.
Isn't the labor market, just like any other market in this country, supply and demand? If you have a supply of well-trained workers, people who can do it, actually people who are hungrier than the people born here, won't that make it a better marketplace?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Immigrants coming to this country are looking to better themselves. They're looking for opportunities. They are coming here hungry to be successful.
I don't know what this has to do with Romney.
Well, I'm trying to get back to that.
Sorry.
How do I think that being the son of an immigrant has affected my life? Well, I think it's affected me a lot. I'm Markham Shafee. I'm Kian's first son. I can remember being a child and going and watching my father be sworn in by a judge and a large group of other individuals to become citizens of the United States. It was a very, very, very important thing to him, and therefore to me too, so it was a big deal. I think immigrants to the United States are some of the best citizens one could ever ask for.
Kian came to the United States and was successful because of a strong work ethic which he contributes to his status as an immigrant. Is this same sort of guts and gumption possible for people who haven't recently immigrated to the United States? Would immigrants work as hard if they didn't believe there were available opportunities? Comment below or visit kcpt.org/yourfellowamericans.
Nick, you have something for us.
Yeah, another question here. Have any studies been done on the impact on food prices if immigrant labor, harvesting, and meat packing was
Peter.
I believe I read in the paper just, I think it was Monday, the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture complaining that they needed more people to do the agricultural work in their state, that agricultural output was well below what it could be if there were more immigrant labor.
There's one point that's important to remember, though, is the question was about what about food prices? The wage component, the labor component of the head of lettuce, of the gallon of milk, is usually, for most food products, less than 5% of the total price. So even if you doubled the price of the labor to produce that food, you're still only talking about a 5% increase in the price of that food. Second, very large misconception in America is that all of our agricultural picking and other agricultural industries are now being done predominantly by illegal labor or a combination of legal and illegal labor from immigrant labor. According to the current population survey, which is done by the Census Bureau, these are a little bit dated, this is 2005, but the numbers haven't changed that much. 56% of agricultural laborers are native-born US citizens, 56%. So the idea that US citizens won't do those jobs is statistically untrue. US citizens are doing those jobs right alongside immigrant labor.
Well, but that's a misleading statistic because that also includes the farmers.
Nick, we got time for 2 more questions.
Okay, they're just doing jobs Americans don't want to do, says Dan. The most common job, though, worked by illegal immigration, according to Dan, immigrants rather, in the United States, is construction workers. These are jobs that are in high demand with Americans without a high school diploma. People like to portray the average illegal as fruit pickers and hotel staff. Illegals are all about construction jobs. Perhaps more of a comment than a question.
It is true that there is a high incidence of immigrants among the construction trades. It is also true that there is a high incidence of illegals in the construction trade relative to the labor force in general. That's another part of, in the recession of 2008, that continues until today, that's another part of the reason that so many immigrants went back home. There was a net outflow of immigrants from the state of, illegal immigrants from the state of Kansas, estimated by the Pew Hispanic Trust of about 8%, 8 to 9% between 2008 and 2011. Much of that was because of the construction trades.
I do have the numbers on that from the same current population survey. In that year, 74% of construction workers were native-born US citizens, so roughly 26% immigrant labor in that field. But it does show you have illegal alien labor competing with US citizen and legal alien labor. It depresses wages.
We don't know that.
Which is why I think, well, and I think economists disagree, and
Well,
I defer to the
economists
economists.
disagree. What a surprise.
But the one thing I would say is the part that seems to make sense to me, right, is that if you make sure that legal immigration works, then you bring down the numbers of people who are going to be here working illegally, which helps bad employers game the system and not only take advantage of workers, pitting them against U.S. workers, but it also allows those employers to have an unfair advantage over honest employers, right? That's one. And since we haven't gotten into the executive action, I would say, you know, people may agree or disagree, like or dislike President Obama. I think that there is a precedent of prosecutorial discretion used by every president in previous administrations. The magnitude of the populations that those actions applied to was less, but the magnitude of the population now is also larger. So in proportionate terms, there are some similarities. But what at least this does, this executive, administrative relief, whatever you might call it, is that people who are working here now will be able to work legally, addressing some of these issues of workers being pitted against each other.
More from the Village Square and our immigration panel gathered at the Community of Christ in Independence in just a moment. But first, tapping into the voices of concern when KCPT partnered with our PBS sister station in St. Louis on an immigration series called Homeland, a number of Missourians shared their unease.
And as Americans, we know that something is very, very wrong.
Protecting our borders, I think, should be the #1 thing. Don't come sneaking into my country. And in my opinion, the illegal immigrants that are here, they're criminals. Show them, show them, show them, go! Go! To see our grandchildren growing up with us, the turmoil, I think it's getting worse. Keep your pace. Turn it on, sissy, turn it on. Power, man. Come on, baby. I grew up in a time when your doors weren't locked. I would love for everything to be the way it was then. I just, you know, times have changed to the point that it's, I don't know, we've gone run amok.
My opinion, if they're illegals, they need to go back. And it don't matter if they've been here 25 years. If I do something illegal, I get fined, I go to jail. They're doing something illegal. It's no different from them than it is me.
It's got to be the government. They're not patrolling the borders like they should.
Arizona is trying to straighten some of this out, but yet they're wanting to step in and reverse it right back.
Like the last 20 years, maybe we've seen more and more. They can't get the people to come and do the jobs. Well, the Mexicans come and will do that job.
Okay, before we get to the last question, I've got a statistic here that I think sort of goes across some of the things you all have talked about. Today, about 13% of the people who live in the United States are immigrants. In 1910, it was 14.7%. But the reason it may seem like every corner you turn around is in 1970, it was 4.7%. And so what's happened is just as our population has grown, the number of immigrants who have come to the United States have grown. And I think it's important that we understand why people have perceptions. In the end, the facts are the facts. The facts are we have fewer percentage today than we had in 1910 of people who weren't born in this country. But Nick, you get the last question.
It's why
here.
people complain all the time as to why there are too many British voices on public television.
That's right. I wasn't going to talk about the British quota,
I'm coming over to Peggy Dunn because sometimes the questions aren't civil and I have to edit them. So if you could just ring the bell once for me. Thank you for that one. So I'm just editing this, self-editing it, but it's an important question. It was to Mr. Kobach. Why does your office continue to, and I'm editing as I go here, to largely overstate, should I say, claims about voter fraud of illegal immigrants, questioning the soundness of the election process?
The numbers are pretty clear. We presented to a federal court last year. 20 cases we knew of by crossing, where we knew the exact name and date of birth. We identified the specific person who was on the voter rolls. And that was only using a very narrow slice in time of people who obtained driver's licenses. And we knew through the driver's license process they were not U.S. citizens, bounced that against the voter rolls. We found those 20. And then we have a case from Seward County, Kansas in 1997, where there was a concerted effort to manipulate the vote to win a countywide election about a hog processing plant. And according to the testimony before the state legislature of the county clerk, not long before the election was to be held, the referendum on whether this would be allowed, about 50 voter registration cards came in a big envelope from the hog processing plant across the border in Guymon, Oklahoma, and they were registering people under mostly false addresses in Seward County, which is liberal Kansas. And on election day, minivan loads of people were brought from the Guymon processing plant to vote in the election. Clerk's office didn't have the ability at that time to refuse to register them or refuse to let them vote. So we have that case of roughly 50. So I haven't been overstating the numbers. The numbers I don't think are, I don't think anyone's going to go, wow, that's huge. But it's just, you just see the tip of the iceberg. One last point about the president's order. The prosecutorial discretion that existed in the past was consistent with law. There are specific legal ways a president can exercise prosecutorial discretion. You can grant what's called withholding of removal, or you can grant parole. And these are done with very small numbers, capped at 1,000 per year, for example, in terms of cancellation or withholding of removal. But nothing like this has ever happened. We have millions of people told, essentially, you have a get-out-of-jail-free card. This piece of paper will prevent you from being deported.
He is a very effective advocate. And he has advocated his position well here tonight. Let me say this, first of all. Unfortunately, we are past our time, but I haven't seen a lot of people leaving, so I think that's a good sign. What we have for each one of you is a civility bell. Now, we give it to you, it's engraved with your name on it, and it's from the Village Square, and we do it for several reasons. One is because we think it's a nice token of our appreciation for your being here with us. But the other reason is we would like you to put it in your office, and when you're involved in a conversation and somebody gets a little uncivil, hit the bell. And our goal is to have 1,000 bells in this town.
Thank you.
So people just stop having to be uncivil. And finally, the final word should always come from George Washington, right? The founder of our country. And his final rule of civility is, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Thank you all, and good night.